name is Kristen Bernard, and it's great to see all these people. It's just amazing. I can't believe there's some people way back there. Can you hear me? All right. I'm actually usually really loud. Try not to get too loud. I'm sorry. Don't worry. I'll try not to be too loud. I'm at the veterinary school. I'm in the Department of Pathobiological Sciences. And I'm a virologist, just like Orly. We talk the same language, and in fact, we both get really excited about viruses. And but I'm an animal virologist, and Orly's a plant virologist. But we do share some things in common. The cells are quite different. We don't have those little plasmodesmata to squeeze through. But I'm really glad that she gave you the background, and Lloyd gave you the background on DNA and RNA and proteins, because we'll talk a little bit about that. But what I want to tell you today is something about West Nile virus transmission and the sequence of transmission. And yes, viruses are really tiny. And in fact, whoops, I'm doing the same thing you are. Orly, where's the little pointer guy? There we go. It's the top one. I thought it was the middle one. Okay, this little guy right here is actually our idea of what West Nile virus is, and people have used really high-powered microscopes, electron microscopes, to actually construct this structure. And I think Lloyd would probably think this is pretty cool too, to actually be able to look at that structure. So this is what it looks like. And we've colored it blue, but it's probably not blue, but that's truly what it looks like. And it is very, very small. It's a millionth of an inch. And in fact, you could fit over 100 billion virus particles on the surface of a dime. So here's an amazing fact for you, if you remember that one. It's pretty cool. And that particle, as Orly told you, is actually made up of protein. And Lloyd told you all about proteins, so I don't need to describe that. You guys got that on the quiz later, right? All right, so it's made up, whoops, I went too soon. See, I really am thinking. Anyway, it's made up of proteins. Plant viruses are almost always just proteins, but actually animal viruses also usually have lipid as well. And West Nile virus, in fact, is made up of protein as well as lipid. Just like that lipid test that you go and get your blood test to see how you're doing, your HDLs versus your LDLs, it's lipid. Okay, so it actually comes from your cells. And inside that is our genome. And it's tiny. It's 11,000 nucleotides. And as Orly pointed out, that's extremely tiny. That's 300,000 times smaller than the human genome. It really is amazing. And when you start to think about these things, it's really amazing. But that genome is really like the musical score. So to come back to Dan's theme for the evening, and it dictates the sequence for all of the events that's going to happen in that virus life cycle. That 11, in the case of West Nile virus, which is actually made up of RNA, not DNA, a single strand of RNA, which is what I'm showing you right here. It dictates the sequence of everything in that life cycle. And it's actually 10 genes. It makes 10 proteins. And so let's talk about that. And as Orly told you, the virus is going to use the host cell's machinery to replicate. And it gets inside that cell. We're not going to talk about that because we could do a lot of talking about just how it gets inside the cell. But it gets inside that cell, and one cell can produce 1,000 particles, just like in the plant viruses. That is amazing. It's not like your cell. You always think about things dividing in half, a cell or a bacterium. You have one, it becomes two, it becomes four, it becomes 8, it becomes 16, it becomes 32. No, we have one that becomes thousands. I didn't draw 1,000 particles on there, but it becomes thousands. It's really amazing, and it's because it takes over the host cell's machinery and copies it. It's like a copier. It's using its genome and all the machinery to make thousands of particles. Thank goodness we have a good immune response. So let's start with the sequencing. Let's talk about transmission and the sequence. So when West Nile virus, and I'm going to talk about West Nile virus now, a mosquito that's infected with West Nile virus, here a little blue, I kept with that blue theme here. When it infects a bird and bites a bird, it actually is depositing West Nile virus with the saliva into its host, into the bird during the feeding. And then it can replicate and produce thousands of virus particles per cell in that bird. So here we've got all that little tiny inoculation turns into thousands and thousands of particles. And in the blood, it contains lots and lots of West Nile virus in the blood of that bird. And in fact, there's 50,000 to over 1 million virus particles in a teaspoon of blood. That's a lot of virus when you think about it. Okay, that's a ton of virus. And it's happening within just a couple days that you have this much virus in the blood of a sparrow or another bird. When a new mosquito comes along and feeds, what happens? Well, the virus comes up when it feeds on the blood, and it gets into the intestine of that mosquito. So what's the next sequence? Well, it's going to replicate in that mosquito, and that's a neat, really neat thing, and I study a lot of mosquito-borne viruses, is that this virus can actually infect both mammals and avian species and mosquito species. So when it gets into that midgut or the intestine of the mosquito, so I'm showing you here, this is just a diagram of a mosquito cut in half. I'll tell you, I'd like to have all our mosquitoes cut in half. What happens is it replicates. It gets inside the cell and makes thousands of copies. And then what happens? Well, it actually then moves into the equivalent of a mosquito blood, which is called the hemocoel. It moves in there and then spreads to the other tissues. And here, it's actually getting into the salivary gland of that mosquito. And what does it do there? It replicates and makes thousands of copies per cell. And then what happens? Well, it actually then, when that mosquito bites, when she bites another bird or other animal, will deposit more virus. And this can happen in 7 to 10 days with West Nile virus. It depends, temperature outside, etc. But it can happen very rapidly. But it's very interesting, and this mosquito is key to West Nile virus being able to cycle throughout. All right, what's the next step in this sequence? Well, it's repeated over and over and over again. We have an infected mosquito biting a bird, and that has virus in its blood. We now have an uninfected mosquito feeding on it, becoming infected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is how West Nile virus survives in nature. Oh, what happens when a person is bitten? That's what we care about, right? Well, it's just like the bird. When the mosquito is infected with West Nile virus and bites a person, we get West Nile virus deposited in the saliva into the person, and it's going to replicate in the cells of the body. And here in particular, we have virus replicating in the kidneys and in the spleen and lymph nodes, and we get quite a bit of virus being produced. But actually, what about virus in the blood? In this case, we actually do not have enough West Nile virus getting into the blood for a mosquito to become infected. So humans do not transmit it back to a mosquito. And we call that a dead end. We're dead end hosts. Well, how does it make you sick? Well, some people just have a fever, and in fact, you kind of feel like you have the flu. You have aches and maybe a headache, you kind of malaise, you just feel lousy. We call that West Nile fever. And this is probably mostly because your immune system is fighting against the virus. And the consequence of that is you just feel really lousy. And you've all had the flu or something like the flu, and I'm sure you know what that's all about. And that's what having the West Nile virus is usually like. But if the virus enters the brain and infects the brain or the spinal cord, we get a very severe neurologic disease. And that's what you hear a lot about in the news when you hear somebody that's very sick and goes to the hospital with West Nile virus. And this, fortunately, is not as common. How common is it? What's the chance of getting sick? Well, here I have given you 150 little stick figures. I'm not an artist, so I drew stick figures. And if these 150 people were bitten by an infected mosquito, how many people would get West Nile fever? 30. So 20% of people, if you're bitten and infected by a mosquito, would get the West Nile fever. Just that malaise, a little, don't feel good. How many would get the neuroinvasive disease? 1. So 1 out of 150 would actually get that neuroinvasive disease where you'd have to go to the hospital. And really, you were very, very sick. So what's the sequence in the end? The transmission sequence, we go from the infected mosquito to the bird, who infects a new mosquito, to a bird, who infects a new mosquito, and then occasionally we infect people. And whether or not we get disease, well, we really would like to understand that more. Sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. And in the end, this virus genome, this 11,000 nucleotides, these 10 genes, have orchestrated this entire thing. So that is the musical score here for this virus. And in the end, whoops, we want to try to understand. I still don't have this little pointer down. You'd think after all this time I'd have this down. We'd like to understand how this virus really is doing all the orchestration. There's a lot we understand now, but we'd like to understand more. And how can we actually stop and change that transmission cycle and the disease in the human? And that's the kinds of things that people like me are studying. So thank you.